bridge into our conversation on leading in times like these. Leadership is so key. We know that leadership sets tone, leadership sets vision, leadership looks at context and develops the narrative of what we are leading in and how we shall lead. So I'm excited to join you all in a conversation on leading in times like these. And as we enter in to the conversation, I hope you all are comfortable. I think we're going to talk about some things that matter. So I will launch into it, and I look forward to your questions and conversation following. So at the 1963 March on Washington and elsewhere, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of the fierce urgency of now, the need for immediate, vigorous, and positive action on civil rights. He said, quote, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now, and in this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there's such a thing as being too late. This is no time for apathy or complacency. This is time for vigorous and positive action." He goes on to say in other speeches that a time comes when silence is betrayal, and when inaction is silence's tag team partner. Why is it important to have conversations today on race, on religious differences? Why is understanding our privilege important in this conversation? And how do we then leverage our privilege wherever it may fall in the spectrum? Racial privilege, educational privilege, financial privilege. How do we then leverage that privilege to dismantle the systems of inequities that exist today? Our country was built on a narrative that included words of freedom, of access to land and property, of equality, of land of the free and land of the brave. As stated in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And since those words were written on a page, we clearly have begun to expand that notion that it may also apply to women are also created equal. And then as we defined man and woman, we've actually evolved from thinking of some as 3/5 of a man or a woman because of the race of their skin. And now we are claiming and looking at all of humanity, sometimes with dignity, decency, and respect, with the right to access laws and rights and privileges, and sometimes not. We know that this country has actually not lived up to these ideals. As the Kerner Commission pointed out way back in 1968, America has two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. And that could be said today, although it wouldn't be simply Black and white, it would be Black and other races and other ethnicities and other socioeconomic categories. But it's still true in many respects today because this country, as many of us know, was segregated by housing patterns that were legislated, not just happened to occur, but were legislated by federal, state, and local governments in violation of our Constitution. We then have seen that play itself out then by those segregated patterns dictating segregation in our schools and community events, even water fountains. The result of that is what has been stated in many different publications, and one in particular in June, Washington Post article entitled "The Black-White Economic Divide is as Wide as It Was in 1968." The article goes on to state that in 2016, the typical middle-class Black household had $13,000 in wealth versus $150,000 for the median white household, an even larger gap in terms of percentage than there was in 1968. As of 2016, the most recent year for which the data was available, you then would have to combine the net worth of 11 and a half Black households to get the net worth of one typical white household in the United States. So what we're saying with this is that some things have changed, some things have remained the same, and we have got to continue to push ourselves as an organization, a ministry, and a people, a community member, to right some of these wrongs. So how did we get to this divide, this gap, which is then also feeding into so much of the divisiveness we even have in our political landscape today? How did we get here? One of the significant contributors to this separate America is the segregated housing pattern in this country. And usually, when I speak on this segregated housing pattern and how it was de jure, dictated by law, many of my most progressive friends and colleagues who haven't read The Color of Law yet say, wow, I never heard of this before. So perhaps one of my subtitles for this conversation today could be, if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody around to hear it, does it make a sound? Just because we haven't heard about it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And what's surprising is that so many folks who are even in our housing sector are just learning about this today. So let me just share a few facts with you that have informed even our federal platform of our Cost of Home National Advocacy Campaign. That is, we have now launched. We're a year plus into that campaign within the Habitat Network. Starting in the 1930s, the Federal Housing Administration began insuring private loans that would ultimately help millions of white families in this country obtain affordable, low down payment mortgages and join the middle class. But this insurance was specifically denied to communities where Black households lived, and through the practice of redlining, continued to exclude Black households from living outside of certain areas, and oftentimes living then restricted to areas that did not have appreciation and did not allow for wealth growth, wealth development. In the 1940s, we saw this pattern continue to play itself out, not only coming from the Federal Housing Administration, but then play out through private lenders and the way in which they decided and made their decisions on access to credit and lending decisions. After World War II, Black veterans were similarly excluded from participating in federal programs such as the GI Bill. The GI Bill provided access to home ownership opportunities for white vets, denied those same opportunities to Black vets. Both fought in the same war, both came back home to the same home country. And what resulted was that there were generations of African Americans who descended from these veterans who did not have access to wealth development, such that when we were hit with financial crises in this country, they weren't able to lean on a cushion of wealth that was possibly tied to the equity in their property. When they went through a health crisis, they couldn't lean on that wealth to send their children to college. They couldn't refi their homes, right? So we see how this plays itself out in very practical, ordinary ways in which we live in this country. This notion that we are all imbued with inalienable rights was restricted. We provided as a country a subsidy to grow the white middle class, but we denied that same subsidy to African American homes. It is in that context, in that history, that Habitat was born. It is in that context and history that we continue to operate and do the great work of our mission, putting God's love into action. So we have this context of the housing crisis, of injustices in housing, that is further amplified now when we're looking at the pandemic of COVID. Pre-existing conditions of diabetes and high blood pressure are coupled with pre-existing conditions of lack of access to affordable housing options and solutions, right? So we're experiencing multiple pandemics, even on the streets of our country, where people are demonstrating because they are feeling completely left out of finding justice, even within our criminal justice system. When we look at our criminal justice system, we see that it's rife with disparities as well, and systemic issues that overly criminalize people because of the color of their skin or socioeconomic status. Bryan Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, says that the United States incarcerates more of its citizens than any other nation in the world. The increase in the jail and prison population from less than 200,000 people in 1972 to 2.2 million today has led to unprecedented prison overcrowding and put tremendous strain on state budgets. He goes on to say that the United States has only 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its imprisoned population. Matthew Desmond, the Pulitzer Prize winning author of the book Evicted, combines those systemic injustices and their intersection with housing and with the criminal justice system. And he says that if incarceration had come to define the lives of men from impoverished Black neighborhoods, eviction was shaping the lives of women, such that poor Black men were locked up and poor Black women were locked out. Even with these challenges, in this context, we have to stand up and lead. Whew, if we're not tired enough going through data after data, realizing the context in which many of us operate, if we're courageous enough to be honest about that context, we then have to find a way to lead in times like these. But I want to step back and ask, what is causing many of us in this moment to cower rather than to lead? To turn from our faith traditions even and cower rather than lead? I'll name just two things. The first is fear. I think many of us give into fear rather than acknowledging our fear and to keep it moving. We allow our fear of others who are different than we are to block our compassion and recognition of another's humanity. We allow our fear of being vulnerable, of admitting where we've fallen short, of being humble enough to say, you know what, I didn't get this race thing, I didn't get this inequity thing, but now I'm going to work very hard to figure it out and to be a contributor to truly bringing justice through the work that I do in my communities that I serve. Many dismiss or turn from the hard conversations because we fear that we might say something wrong, because we don't want to be seen as the person who doesn't get it. After the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Rayshard Brooks here in Atlanta, many of my well-meaning white friends asked me what they could do. And I simply told them, do what you do if that was your brother or your sister. Do what you do if that was your husband or your daughter. Stop giving into the fear of discussing and confronting our own discomfort with race and other differences and interacting with people who are different from you. One of the most horrible aspects of the segregated housing patterns that many of us grew up in is that it prevented us from having unintentional run-ins with people who are different than us at the grocery store, the library, or the PTA meeting. That unintentional run-in moment is a moment to connect as a neighbor and to begin to see our neighbors don't all have to look like we look. The housing issue, the segregation that we've experienced has contributed to even the divisiveness we see now in our political landscape, because we haven't been trained or brought up in environments oftentimes where we've unintentionally run into someone who doesn't look like us and still called them a neighbor. So we look at them as other, as different, as less deserving of the same benefits that we sometimes take advantage of. We then also allow our fear to disqualify us from opportunities that expand our horizons professionally and personally. We've got to learn how to name our fears and to face them, and to then, in the face of our fears, call upon courage and realize sometimes when we face our fears, those fears that we have are not real in the first place. They're false evidence appearing real, and they have to be overcome so that we can really become the communities we were called to become. So sometimes we give into fear, other times we give into hopelessness because we're so tired and we keep feeling defeated or unable to deal with such an overwhelmingly large issue, right? How do you boil an ocean? Well, hopelessness is something we've got to combat. As people of faith, whether your faith is tied to a Christian tradition or a Jewish tradition or a Muslim tradition, it's faith nonetheless. And we've got to link our faith to hope and link our hope to faith. For hope and faith are connected. Hope and faith are tag team partners and pushing us towards all that God will have in store for our lives. Hope directs our faith and guides our faith. It gives our faith a direction to aim for. Hope energizes our faith and keeps us trusting in a God, even when we don't know for sure if we're going to get where we hope to go. Faith and hope are complementary. Faith is grounded in the reality of our past. Hope is looking to the reality of our future. Helen Keller says that faith is the strength by which a shattered world shall emerge into the light. We've got to stop giving up too easily. We've got to stop giving into politics and partisanship. Why are we allowing the issue of housing to be a partisan issue, right? We've got to not relinquish our birthright and claim the hope that has been given to us as a gift. For Brian Stevenson goes on to say, hopelessness is the enemy of justice. We've got to fight to reclaim our hope, to stir our hope up in one another. Leading in times like these requires leaders to insist on creating inspiring and hopeful moments with those we work with. Find the treasures even in the dark moments. How do we do that? One is to encourage our staff, our teams to dream again. I know it sounds crazy. Toni Morrison, one of my favorite authors, often was quoted as saying, when entrusted with power and position, dream a little before you think. Sometimes we rush to the to-dos and we don't step back and think again. You know, when we were kids, we called it playtime. Sometimes we need to incorporate playtime again, even in our most serious business meetings, because it's in that moment that creativity and innovation are triggered and inspired. We've got to be willing to dream again, even in the face of a context that is dark and heavy, where we're counting and continuing to count the numbers of people who are dying. And they're not just numbers, obviously, they're family members, they're brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers. When we begin to imagine a world where freedom and justice reign, where our children are protected and not trafficked for sex, where we all have decent and affordable places to call home, where we're able to connect across differences. Once we do that, we can then create new relationships that others have shied away from. We can identify hidden treasures in our very midst and perhaps go to the moon because of all the treasures that person, that relationship, that community can bring to the work that we're doing. A writer, an author, Olga Rosmanieff, says, when we do this, we build in places that others have avoided. And she says, when you do build in darkness, you have faith. When the light returns, you've made yourself a fortress. You may even then find yourself needed and sought by others as a beacon in their darkness. We need to dream again, encourage imagination and creativity. We need to be bold and courageous leaders who are courageous enough to speak truth to power, to reveal invisible pieces, people and causes and needs, who have the moral stamina to outlast the racism, the sexism, and the other isms of this age. We need bold and courageous leaders who are bold and brave enough to push conversations and initiatives that force each of us out of our bubbles. When we are bold and courageous, when we lead on the edge, in times like these, we actually begin to attract people who had once not taken us seriously, especially when we look at the intergenerational nature of the work that we're doing and the needs that we have. When we are bold and courageous, millennials look our way, partners look our way and say, wait a minute, they're serious about making a transformative change in the communities that they serve. We need leaders who are willing to have the hard conversations, who are willing to enter into spaces and places that others have turned from or rendered undevelopable, right? I made that word up, but that's kind of, we look at them like, we're not going to include them in our GSA or in our strategic plan. No one can really help that area, those people, right? We need leaders and people who are bold and brave enough to admit their privilege and then not get mired or waste time in defending their guilt and trying to push their guilt away, but actually use their privilege for good to help others who are less privileged. If it makes you cry when you recognize it, then cry, but keep working, keep pushing, push against racism and seek truth. Be brave and bold in ways that you have denied, about issues that you have felt overwhelmed by. Dr. Martin Luther King famously said in his letter from the Birmingham jail that in a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men and women are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. And this is my favorite part. He says, then whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. So all of this divisive language that we're hearing does nothing but hurt us. Because he goes on to say, I can never be all that I ought to be until you are all that you ought to be. And you're never going to be all that you ought to be until I am all that I ought to be. We need bold and brave leaders who are willing to look at our historical truths and find ways to bring people together around a core desire to put hard work in to correct historical ills. When we do that, we defy the darkness. We need to provide a beacon of light with our leadership in times like these. We do that best when we lead with love. Now, I know love is often overused. It's often rendered anemic and sentimental. But when we use that love coupled with strong leadership, that love becomes transformative, powerful. It is taken from an anemic place to a place of action. And in the workplace, that love is called empathy. In a recent Harvard Business Review article called Creating a Purpose-Driven Organization, the authors say that when you lead with that empathy, you create a purpose-driven organization because you begin to direct people towards a purpose that's already out there, that you've just helped to identify and give value to. And when you do that, purpose is no longer a lofty ideal. It has practical implications for your company's financial health and competitiveness. And all of a sudden, your staff, the people that you work with, begin to find meaning in their work. We can do that easily within the Habitat Network because our mission is so powerful. And our history of implementing and engaging that mission has truly transformed communities. How much more so now do we need to put our love into action? Because when we do that, according to this study by the Harvard Business Review, people then begin to give more freely. They defy conventional economic assumptions about self-interest and they grow rather than stagnate. They do more and they do it better by tapping into that power. We can then begin to transform an entire organization, and that organization can then transform the communities that it serves. When you lead with love and empathy, you're better able to connect with the people that you lead, to drive production, and to win together. Maya Angelou says, I've learned that people will forget what you said. So you're going to forget everything I said today, but you'll not forget what or how I made you feel. Leading with love can truly transform. I've experienced it personally, and I've tried to translate that into also doing so in my professional space. As I close, I'll just share a little bit about that personal experience. I'm the daughter of an African-American man from Georgia and a white woman of German descent who grew up in Minnesota. In 1968, the year I talked about in the opening, my mother participated in an exchange program where she came from Minnesota to Spelman College here in Atlanta, a historically Black college. She was there in 1968 when she met my father. You can imagine her German Catholic family in Minnesota hearing that their white daughter went to Atlanta in an exchange program and wanted to marry a Black man. Pretty taboo in 1968. And as a result, my grandfather, her father, became very resistant and wrote hate mail, letter after letter after letter. My mother and father went ahead and got married and had me. Grandfather was still writing hate mail. About the age of 2, my parents took me to Minnesota to meet him in person for the first time. And my parents tell me the story that when they pulled up in the driveway, they couldn't open the door fast enough. And I jutted out my little toddler way and ran to my grandfather and jumped, and he caught me because he had no other choice. And I hugged his neck so hard and he cried, and he never said another hateful word. That was a transformative moment where love conquered all. I've seen it in my own life, dealing with issues of difference, dealing with crossing bridges to people who look nothing like me, having the opportunity to share, to break bread, to realize that if we overcome fear and hopelessness, dream again, step out with courage, and insist on love and action, we can not only transform our personal, private homes, our organizations, but it cascades into everything we touch in the communities that we serve. It's in essence being a servant leader. and in essence, engaging the ideals that we claim to live by. So on today, a day where we can truly use some unifying messaging, some unifying work, some acknowledgement that we've not gotten it right all the time, but we're going to commit again to doing better, to learning more, to engaging, to overcoming fear and hopelessness so that we can lead in times like these. I commend this thought unto you, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you for having me today.
Natasha, thank you so much. What an incredibly powerful message on an incredibly powerful day. So thank you for helping us kick this conversation off with such an important topic to so many of us, not only in our local affiliates, but across our state and across our nation. We are honored to have you share this message with us today.
Well, honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yeah. So friends, let me know what questions you have. I see one here. Awesome. So Kim says she just wants to thank you for your incredible work. I would love a copy of what you had to say. So if you would be willing to share that, Natasha, I would be happy to put that back out, to our participants today. Some comments from participants, just a beautiful story. How can we start a DEI program at the affiliate level that works? I would love your input. That's from Judy.
I love that. Yeah. I love the guarantee at the end. That works. I don't know. I mean, we're all doing it. So I can't guarantee that it will work, but I can give you some thoughts. So I'm happy to share a few thoughts. So great. I'm in the process now. I've only been in my position a little over a month within Habitat. And so I'm in the co-creation phase. Your organization, you may know well because you've been in it for a long time, but there's got to be a co-creation component to your strategy formation. So, right, it's one of the things I think we like to do with this is we put it on, the DEI work becomes a task. I want to encourage you to make DEI part of your overall strategy. It should not just be a task. It should be a priority, but it should be part of your strategy. It should be at the forefront, leading the work that you do in all of your lines of business. It's not only an HR function. In our context, as I talked about the context of housing, it should be an operationalized strategy. So co-creation, looking at your senior team, starting at your board and going through your organization, pulling them in, making sure that DEI as part of your strategy is also well-resourced and is incorporated into every line of business. One of the ways we're doing that is we're going to start out with an assessment and audit of our organization. It's pretty comprehensive when we're looking at our global network, but we need to first understand where we are with this, right? There may be some things that we're already doing well. We need to identify them. There may be some gaps, places that we're missing. We've got to develop and understand those as opportunities. And then we do priority setting. We do mapping out of timing, the same way you do a regular strategic plan. But now DE&I needs to be incorporated in it. That means also that you're starting to define what those terms mean for your organization, right? Listening is part of the co-creation. So I'm doing listening and visioning sessions around our network. Listening builds that trust, it demonstrates respect, and it says to the folks that you're working with at all levels, I see you and I hear you. That's essential to even an inclusive strategy, right? You're looking at an asset-based appreciation for what the strengths are and what the expertise is in your organization. I'm just giving you some points. Then you're looking at impact-focused solutions. So you've done an audit to determine where you are. Now you've got to determine how you're going to operationalize what you've defined as your DE&I lens. And that then becomes a focus on how you can have your greatest impact internally and externally in terms of your community strategy, your development strategy. How are you reaching your homeowners? Who are you presenting yourself to be as an organization? When people look at your website, do they see a serious commitment to DE&I? When they look at your marketing materials, do they see themselves? Does it look like your organization is welcoming of people from all backgrounds, all races, right? Actions then need to be grounded in research and good practices, keeping track of the work you're doing in that space, holding folks accountable, right? We measure what matters. So how are you measuring the impact of your DE&I work? And then finally, capturing the learning as seeds for reimagining how the world can be transformed. That could be book clubs, that could be listening sessions with your homeowners, listening session with your pipeline, listening sessions with your staff, listening to people who've left, right? Oftentimes we just want to talk to people who stayed. What happens, is your exit interviewing process really comprehensive? Are you getting some of the gems from the folks who've decided to move on, to leave? Maybe good, helpful information as you develop your strategy. So once you go through those initial steps, then you start thinking about your strategy development, doing what I call a SWOR analysis instead of a SWOT analysis. And that SWOR analysis is strengths, looking at your weaknesses, looking at your opportunities, and your risks. That's the R. And how do you mitigate your risks? You keeping track of your risks is, looking at how, the risk that your strategy isn't realized, the risk that your strategy isn't operationalized and put into a programmatic component of your work, the risk that your brand, you're stepping out there courageously, but you're not following through with works. You're not following through with strategy. You're not following through with programs. And the fear that some folks have, if I step out too courageously, I'm going to lose donors and I'm going to lose partners. Well, maybe you need to focus on gaining some new partners that you haven't really stretched out to gain. Maybe you need to focus on donors who you haven't even solicited or invited to be a part of your program because they just don't look like the donors you've always had, right? So this is really a stretching piece that requires strong leadership. And it's exciting work because it opens up doors and avenues that we haven't explored before. And we may come out of that with greater treasure. So those are just a few tips as you think about implementing it at your affiliate.
Just a few.
Just a few.
Just
Since you asked.
That was amazing. Thank you. Okay, so Deanna Davies, I see you have your hand raised. I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question, okay? Deanna, are you there?
She might be muted. Looks like she's muted.
Yeah, she's muted. All right. So anybody else have any other questions for Natasha? Oh, I see I have another one here. Okay, so from Glaisa. Glaisa is a board member actually at my affiliate, Natasha. What recommendations do you have to help foster the connection between DEI and Habitat's mission for those who are resistant to see the importance of the initiatives?
That is such a setup question for me because it's essential to everything I'm messaging as I go into the network. So with Habitat in particular, which is why I'm so excited about this work at Habitat, we have 3 imperatives that truly amplify the need to focus in on DE&I seriously. First, we have a historical imperative. Habitat was founded in Americus, Georgia, at a time when the country was very divided, especially racially divided. Clarence Jordan was the mentor of Millard Fuller, the founder of Habitat. And Clarence Jordan founded Koinonia Farms, the country's first interracial communal farm, in a place like Americus that was so heated and divided that Dr. Martin Luther King and his associates refused to go. That's how heated Americus was. They went into Alabama, but they wouldn't go into Americus, right? And so when Clarence Jordan founded Koinonia, he defied the norms of the day because he said, no, Black folks and white folks are going to sit at the same table. That's an act of equity. Not only are they going to sit at the same table and break bread together, but they're going to have the same salaries. Another act of equity, pay equity. And in doing so, he created community. We have a historical imperative because Habitat was birthed from that genesis. Habitat was birthed with the thought that we would provide housing opportunities to people who would otherwise be denied that opportunity. And many of those were denied because of the race and the color of their skin. So we have a historical imperative. We have a theological imperative at Habitat. Even though we don't require, obviously, that everyone who participates in Habitat is Christian, we have a Christian ethos that informs our mission, putting God's love into action to build hope, faith, communities, and hope, right? So when we do that, that is based on a theological imperative. And that theological imperative of love tracks with the 2 greatest commandments: love the Lord your God, all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those 2 commandments drive our understanding of love and what love in action is all about. It is a neighboring movement. It is a partnering movement. It is a community transforming movement rooted in a theological imperative that pushes us to be inclusive because God came for all of God's children. And lastly, we have a business imperative. We're in the housing sector. We're in a sector whose context I've already laid out has a history of systemic injustices. We have a business imperative to push the envelope with respect to DE&I and all the work that we do.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Any other, so you can send me questions via the chat. You can send it through the Q&A. You can raise your hand and I can unmute you. Any kind of final questions? So Natasha, I first thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. But maybe more importantly, thanks for being the person leading this charge in our organization. You have a powerful position and a powerful story to tell. And your leadership is going to help affiliates across the country recognize how we need to lead without fear, that we need to lead in faith. And so I'm excited to have you join up, to change your role with Habitat International and to be the leader of this conversation for our organization.
Thank you.
I do have one last question for you. Judy wants to know if you have any resources to help us take our DE&I temperature.
Oh, that's a great question. Let's see. We are developing some actually right now. You all have access to My Habitat, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we currently have a lot of stuff up there. I'm working with the team now to try to make it more user-friendly, but we have a whole racial equity and housing site that has materials for you to read, to gain awareness. It has some movies and videos and links and all that kind of stuff. And then it has additional resources, some of which I wouldn't say is a full-on assessment or survey to help you gauge your temperature, but there's some resources that will help you identify some of the areas that you need to work on, to complement, to develop further in some ways in which you're already doing the work probably very well.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, I have one more here, hold on. Chad says that was a wonderful presentation. I look forward to sharing this presentation with our board. I'm excited to move forward with more DE&I material.
Yay,
yeah.
Awesome.
That's
wonderful.
Awesome.
Well, clearly the work that I'm trying to lead is, I'm one person. So I always end with manage expectations moment. And that managing expectations moment isn't a cop-out. It just means we have a pretty broad network. Just within HFHI, let alone our network that goes beyond to the affiliates. One of the most inspiring aspects of the work that I've been doing in Habitat for the last 9 years is working with affiliates, working with you all who are doing the hard work. And so that strategy will encompass, how we can cascade additional resources to you. We're working on training materials. We're working on materials just like those that were just asked about, materials that will continue to equip and empower you to try to do this while you're doing 5 other things at the same time. We realize the capacity at the affiliate level is very strange, just like it is for us. So I look forward to partnering with you, hearing from you, and trying to find ways to work together, complement, and transform communities all over the world. So thank you, Carrie, for having me.
Sounds like a beautiful plan. So friends, thank you for joining us today. I'm sorry we're not in person. I know that this is a pivot from what we're used to, spending 2 days together networking and hearing fantastic keynote speakers, and then going to breakout specific to our roles is something that the ASO prides itself on, being able to provide you on an annual basis. So know that we're here for you. Many of your ASO board members are with us today on the call. So please know that we're in this fight with you, and that whatever resources we can provide to you, we want to be able to do that. You'll find the next 9 months of information of this webinar series on the Habitat Illinois website. So you'll be able to go directly there and see what the next 9 conversations are about. Next month, we're bringing in the president of a consulting group to talk about emergency preparedness. I wonder why we're talking about that. So as in Illinois, a partial shutdown is looming for some of us. All of us Region 1 people are struggling to figure out what we're doing in the next couple of weeks. But, as this pandemic, ebbs and flows, and as this changes how we operate our restores and how we operate our construction sites and our offices. One of the things the affiliate sport organization wanted to bring to you was emergency preparedness. So next month we'll hear from Diane, the president of Logston Group. She'll talk about emergency preparedness. We'll talk about resource development. We're going to talk about restore. We're going to talk about construction, and we're going to talk about volunteers. We're going to talk about board management and all sorts of things, mortgage procedures and regulations.
Yay.
Natasha, you don't have to do that one anymore.
I'm done with it.
Kara
Great work.
Doak's taken that one for the team. So please join us in the rest of this series. Please help, go to Habitat Illinois and register for all of the ones that are relevant to you. And then please share this with your staff. Share this with your board members. Share this with your volunteers. Please, everyone is welcome to join us in this webinar series. We want to be able to provide as much critical information as we possibly can without being in person. So thank you much for your time today. You'll receive a copy of this recording, and all of those registered that weren't able to join us will receive a copy as well. Please share it with your network, share it with your staff and board members and your volunteers so that we can have as many people hear this wonderful message as we were able to today. So thank you much for your time.
Thank you.
We will see you the first Wednesday of next month. So we'll see you December 2nd for emergency preparedness. Have a good day.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.